We begin this presentation with a draft of an 1868 letter from Judge Julius Rockwell, thanking Fanny Kemble for agreeing to do a benefit reading. 30 years earlier, Fanny would be writing to another friend when the stage, indeed her voice, was denied her. Here we see Fanny is depicted in a much-copied image after a portrait of Sir Thomas Lawrence. She was born in London in 1809 into an acting dynasty. Her father, actor Charles Kemble, worked in the shadow of his brother John Philip Kemble and sister Sarah Siddons. In 1822, Charles Kemble assumed the management of Covent Garden Theatre in London. By 1829, it was in dire financial straits. Charles enlisted his daughter to join the family business. She made her debut as Juliet at the age of 19 and was an instant success. Fanny was a reluctant actress. She writes, "The theatrical profession was, however, utterly distasteful to me, though acting itself, that is to say dramatic personation, was not." Flush with Fanny's theatrical success, father and daughter embarked on an American tour in 1832. Her celebrity status only increased. Young ladies styled their hair in Fanny Kemble curls, while Harvard canceled classes during her Boston leg of the tour, since the students would skip class to see her. Fanny recorded her experiences in a journal. Ultimately, she would publish 6 sets of memoirs, which she alternately styled journals or records. Novelist Catherine Maria Sedgwick met Fanny in New York in 1833 and was captivated. Despite the 20-year age difference, Catherine felt something approaching to the enraptured feeling of youth. Catherine urged Fanny to visit her in the Berkshires. During her visits to Lenox, Fanny would often stay at the Curtis Hotel, which she called the Old Red Inn. Later historians have conflated this hotel with the Red Lion Inn in Stockbridge for this reason. Catherine introduced Fanny to her sister-in-law, Elizabeth Sedgwick. Fanny wrote, "Catherine Sedgwick is my best friend in this country, but the whole family have bestowed more kindness upon me than I can ever sufficiently acknowledge. They have all been exceedingly good to me, and the place of their dwelling combines for me the charms of great natural beauty with the associations that belong to the intellect and the affections." Elizabeth and her husband Charles, the clerk of courts, lived in Lenox in a dwelling nicknamed the Hive, a gathering spot for intellectuals, and the home for the Sedgwick School for Girls. Fanny's Journal of a Residence in America was published in 1835. First in England and then in the United States. In it, she revealed her views of the superiority of English society to upstart America. For instance, on a visit to the Library of Congress, she observed, "We looked over Audubon's Ornithology, a beautiful work, and saw a man sitting with his feet upon the table, reading, which is an American fashion. Even the grass was found wanting, for not being mowed soft and thick and smooth like an English lawn." The backlash from a dismayed American readership inspired lampoons, such as this spoof by Fanny Thimble Cutler, and cartoons, such as this one depicting a gluttonous Fanny lying on the ground while her black manservant serves her a bottle of port in a rather compromising position. Fanny, with her mannish hands, dwarfs this particular suitor, presenting an enormous bouquet on his tiptoes. He is, it seems, a great fortune. Consequently, I suppose, in spite of his inches, a great man, Fanny said of her future husband, Pierce Butler. They married in 1834. Pierce was born Pierce Butler Meese. He legally changed his name to Pierce Meese Butler in order to inherit plantation property on the Sea Islands coast of Georgia from his grandfather, Major Pierce Butler. Major Butler was born into the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. He was a member of the British Army, but changed allegiance during the Revolutionary War. In his role as U.S. Senator from South Carolina, Major Butler proposed the Fugitive Slave Clause to be entered into the Constitution in 1787. Pierce and his brother John came into their inheritance in 1836. A current map of the Georgia coast shows traces of rice canals dug by the enslaved people of Butler Island Plantation. Major Butler's property also included Hampton Point, a cotton plantation on neighboring St. Simon's Island. The plantations were managed by Roswell King and his son Roswell King Jr. Fanny wished to observe life on her husband's new property, but wrote, "The owner will go with his brother, but without us, on his expedition to Negro Land." 2 years later, in 1838, Fanny convinced Pierce to let her come with their 2 little girls, Sarah and Frances, called Fan, to the plantation. If you were expecting Tara, you would be sadly mistaken. Fanny wrote to a friend, "The house we inhabit, which was intended merely as the overseer's residence, is inferior in appearance and every decent accommodation to the poorest farmhouse in any part of England." Fanny found the enslaved living in abject squalor. She witnessed the scars of flogging, the scanty diet and clothing, and the treatment of women who worked the fields 3 weeks after giving birth, among other degradations. Once again, Fanny kept a journal of her trip. This time, she addressed it to Elizabeth Sedgwick. She wrote evocative descriptions of the wild beauty of the island. For instance, she described the oak trees. "They always looked to me like so many gigantic druid ghosts, with flowing robes and beards, and locks all of one ghastly gray." In one entry she wrote, "I should like the wild, savage loneliness of the faraway existence extremely, if it were not for the one small item of the slavery. My walks are rather circumscribed, inasmuch as the dikes are the only promenades," wrote Fanny. The swampy conditions necessary for growing rice created an ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes, so malaria was a real threat. Therefore, there were very few white people on the island for most of the year. They would perhaps spend the winter, but made sure to leave before spring got too warm. Fanny loved to fish. She described fishing for catfish with her slave Jack. "Then, too, they hiss and spit and swear at one, and are altogether devilish in their aspect and demeanor, nor are they good for food, except as Jack with much humility said this morning, for colored folks. Good for colored folks, missus. We 'spect not good enough for white people." Fanny also loved to go horseback riding. Daphne, a formerly enslaved woman on the island, recollected, "Fanny Kemble was a famous horsewoman. During her stay, she rode one of the most determined horses that was on the plantation of St. Simon Island. In riding through the wood roads of St. Simon Island, Her hat was often caught by the low-growing limbs from overhead. To these she tied white strings so that the young men of the plantation could see and make clear the way by the following day. Fanny was struck by certain features she noticed in young Daphne and her twin brother Ben. She wrote with shock, "These are two extremely pretty and interesting-looking mulatto children," whose resemblance to Mr. King had induced me to ask Mr. Butler, when first I saw them, if he did not think they must be his children. He said they were certainly like him, but Mr. King did not acknowledge the relationship. The enslaved people found a sympathetic ear with Fanny. She listened to their complaints and relayed them to Pierce until he demanded that she stop. He says that bringing their complaints to me, and the sight of my credulous commiseration, only tend to make them discontented and idle. Daphne married another butler slave, James Alexander, also known as Alec. Fanny described Alec as uncommonly bright and intelligent. He performs all the offices of a well-instructed waiter with great efficiency, and anywhere out of slave land would be able to earn $14 or $15 a month for himself. Though it was against the law, Fanny agreed to teach Alec how to read, while Pierce claimed it impairs their value as slaves, for it instantly destroys their contentedness, and since you do not contemplate changing their condition, it is surely doing them an ill service to destroy their acquiescence in it. After her stint on Butler Plantation, the word that Fanny had written a journal began to spread among her abolitionist friends, including Lydia Child, who urged for the journal to be published. Child was the topic of a conversation between Catherine Sedgwick and William Ellery Channing, whose final address, shown here, was delivered at the church on the hill in Lenox. Pierce Butler forbade his wife from publishing her journal. As the chasm between free North and slave South grew, so grew the chasm in Pierce and Fanny's marriage. In addition to his previous prohibitions on her acting or writing, Pierce made Fanny sign an agreement to break off with those low-bred, vulgar meddlers, the Sedgwicks. Fanny, in turn, accused Pierce of being unfaithful to her, and she was not alone. In 1844, Pierce was challenged to a duel by Mr. James Schott, who accused him of having an affair with Mrs. Schott. After a more famous duel in 1804, Aaron Burr, wanted in New York and New Jersey for the murder of Alexander Hamilton, sought sanctuary on St. Simon's Island at the invitation of Major Butler. While there, Burr survived a Category 4 hurricane, as did 100 Butler slaves, thanks to the effort of head driver Morris. To show his appreciation, Major Butler offered the enslaved Morris his freedom. But since the offer did not extend to his wife and children, Morris turned down the offer and was awarded a silver cup instead. The Butler versus Butler divorce case made national headlines in 1849. They traded accusations, he for desertion, she for cruelty and infidelity. The case was decided in favor of Pierce, who was awarded custody of Sarah and Fan. Fanny began a new career as a reader of Shakespeare plays, but she was still forbidden to publish the Georgia Journal or risk losing her visitation rights. For Fanny, Lenox served as her forest of Arden. She wrote, "You know the sort of life that is lived here, the absence of all form, ceremony, or inconvenient conventionality whatever. In 1849, Charles Sedgwick arranged for the purchase of a charming cottage called the Perch for Fanny. It was located on the new county road to the courthouse. Shortly thereafter, the Hive was moved from Walker Street to this new road, which would eventually be called Kemble Street. Fanny developed a reputation as a free-spirited eccentric, which was a good thing or a bad thing, depending on one's point of view. An 1849 item in the Greensboro, North Carolina Patriot relates, "It is stated that she has been rusticating in the country places in Massachusetts, still with the breeches on." Of course, Mrs. or Miss, as the case may be, Sedgwick and the friends of the school at Lenox consider the girls highly honored by the patronage of this female genius in trousers. Nevertheless, if she was addicted to the same habit during her season of connubiality with Mr. Butler, we do not wonder that he sued for a divorce. In this cartoon, Fanny is riding a horse, astride. In 1850, Reverend Thomas Pynchon was newly assigned to Trinity Church, a simple wooden structure on Church Street in Lenox. On his first day, he said, he saw a figure seated on the steps. It arose as he approached, and shaking a forefinger at him, said in a very deep and impressive voice, "Your music is execrable, execrable. If you will have that organ sent to Pittsfield for repairs and tuning, I will pay for it." The figure was Fanny. In her records of a later life, Fanny described the two little mountain villages of Lenox and Stockbridge possessed, in the proper sense of the term, by a devil of their own making called planchette. As illustrated, the device was a mid-19th century Ouija board. Fanny told of an encounter with a Mrs. S., who was terrified of the oracle. "Why," returned Mrs. S., with some decorous hesitation and reluctance to utter the words that followed, "the last time we consulted it, it told us we were all a pack of damned fools." "Oh," exploded I believe in planchette. I believe in planchette." As it turns out, Mrs. S. was Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was published in 1852. She is pictured here with her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, whose Lenox farm would be purchased by John Rathbun and named Windhurst. Stowe's work was a topic of discussion between Fanny and the Shaw family, fellow sojourners on a trip Fanny took to Italy in 1853. Fanny's description of life on the Butler plantation made an impression on a teenaged Robert Gould Shaw. Fanny rented Windhurst for the summer of 1857, according to a letter written by George Walker of Lenox to his sister Sarah Davis of Bloomington, Illinois, who was married to Judge David Davis, campaign manager for Abraham Lincoln. George described Fanny, "How large she has got to be, yet she has lost none of that elasticity in her gait, and her eye still burns as keenly as ever." The letter also refers to the Panic of 1857. Pierce suffered great losses in the Panic of 1857 due to poor stock speculation. His rumored gambling habit did not help matters. By 1859, in order to stave off bankruptcy, Pierce decided to sell some of his property. 436 enslaved people were auctioned for $300,000, about $10 million in today's dollars. It was one of the largest slave sales ever in the U.S. and known today as the weeping time, as families were torn apart. Even the heavens were said to be crying, as heavy rain fell throughout the two-day auction. Importantly for Fanny, her youngest daughter Fan reached her majority in 1859. 1859 was also the year of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which sparked the Civil War. Fanny wrote, "The Southern states are loud and vehement threats of secession if the Republican candidate is elected. But their bluster is really lamentably ludicrous, for they are without money, without credit, without power, without character, in short, sans everything. But so many millions of slaves, sans good numbers of whom they would also be the very moment they cut themselves adrift from the protection of the North. Fanny's opinion matched that of the most astute Northern politicians of the time, and they were all wrong. Fanny's two daughters were also chroniclers of a sort. The eldest, Sarah, kept a diary. In 1861, she wrote of a visit to the Perch, where she found her sister Fan crying over the report that their father had been jailed as a Southern sympathizer, charged with supplying guns to the rebel cause. Sarah also described the music room of the Hive, where her mother was to give a reading. The grand piano with its heaps of music holding its own at one side. At the other was Mother's reading table with massive silver candelabra, exquisite flowers, and her great quarto Shakespeare. It stood before a window over which fell a crimson curtain, which brought out her figure in her white dress, and her beautiful head with its wreath of dark purple pansies. The audience consisted only of the family and 3 or 4 friends, not a dozen in all. She read us As You Like It, most beautifully. Elizabeth Sedgwick's son, Major William D. Sedgwick, was mortally wounded in the Battle of Antietam in 1862. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw honeymooned at Ventfort in Lenox before meeting his ultimate fate as the head of the Massachusetts 54th Colored Unit at Fort Wagner in July 1863. Before that final battle, Shaw and the Mass 54th were stationed on St. Simon's Island. Shaw wrote to his wife Annie, "I forgot to tell you that the Negroes at Mr. Butler's remembered Mrs. Kemble very well, and said she was a very fine lady." The first action of the Mass 54th was a controversial one, the burning of nearby Darien, Georgia, a seaport where cotton was often exported to England. These ruins of cotton warehouses were constructed with tabby, a mixture of oyster shells, lime, and sand. Meanwhile, England was more than a casual observer. The country felt a sense of superiority in abolishing slavery in 1833. However, the South's cheap cotton aided England's dress manufacturing industry. The Confederacy made repeated attempts to persuade Great Britain to end its neutral stance and side with the South. In 1863, 25 years after her stay at Butler Plantation, Fanny published Journal of a Residence on a Georgian Plantation. There is a debate as to the journal's impact on England's ultimate decision to stay neutral, but it angered those in the South, who believed its publication influenced England in refusing to loan funds to the Confederacy. Journalist Q. K. Philander Doesticks, pen name for Mortimer Thompson of the New York Tribune, had attended the Weeping Time auction. His article for the Tribune was republished in 1863 as a sequel to Fanny's Journal. John Henry Hopkins, Episcopal Bishop of Vermont, had published a religious tract, The Bible Views of Slavery, which claimed that slavery was divinely sanctioned in the Bible. Bishop Hopkins' tract was republished in 1863 to support the candidacy of Judge George Woodward, a Democrat, for governor of Pennsylvania. This pamphlet, published as rebuttal, juxtaposed pro-slavery statements of Bishop Hopkins and Judge Woodward with selections from Fanny's Journal. In Pennsylvania, a group of Episcopal clerics protested Bishop Hopkins' views. Among the signers of the protest was Reverend Phillips Brooks, a future Bishop of Massachusetts who would dedicate the rectory for the new Trinity Church in Lenox. was yet another family diarist. She wrote 10 Years on a Georgia Plantation, which spanned the years of Reconstruction and published in 1883. She accompanied her father Pierce on a post-war salvage mission to implement a sharecropping system with the former slaves. The tone of Fan's journal is quite different than that of her mother's. For instance, Fan made sure that a portrait of Robert E. Lee hung over the mantel of the plantation house. Fan describes her new employees as being so like children, so unreasoning and easily influenced, that they are led away by any promise that sounds fair. Soon, Fan was the last of the butlers on the plantation. In 1867, Pierce, in his attempt to operate under the new system of labor, stayed on the island too far into the summer and died of malaria. Fan, like her father, married someone from England, an Anglican clergyman, the Honorable James Wentworth Lee. Unlike her mother, Fan gave her husband a voice in her journal. He writes to a friend, "Here we are, then, safely settled down on a rice plantation in Georgia, about 4,000 miles away from our friends on your side of the water, and yet hearing every day the same language spoken, although it must be confessed in a very peculiar and hardly intelligible manner, by our sable brethren." I believe brethren is a proper term in these free and enlightened days. Reverend Lee held services for the sable brethren in a small room on Butler Island. In 1875, members of the congregation began construction of an Episcopal church in Darien, with land donated by Fan. It was named St. Cyprian's, after a martyred African saint of the early church. The photographs and watercolor illustrations of the Butler plantation presented here are courtesy of Amelia Montague Watson. She was fascinated by Fanny Kemble, and her interest took her to the Georgia plantations in 1915, nearly 80 years after Fanny's visit. She photographed and took stories from former enslaved people and their descendants. Watson took this picture of Celia Davis, who was eager to give her recollections of Fanny. Watson's transcriptions preserved Celia's dialect. Watson was introduced to Dora Alexander and her sister Mary Mann, daughters of Daphne and James Alexander. Amelia and Dora struck up a correspondence, with Dora sharing stories from her mother, Daphne. Now in her 90s, Daphne was still able to remember Fanny. She was as fair as a lily. To see her, one would imagine beholding an angel. She described her former mistress's riding habit, a black broadcloth with trousers of same material strapped under her heels, with black silk hat and high boots to match. Daphne also recalled the time when Mrs. Pierce Butler, she was then, gave me a beautiful dress. She had me to come to the house, and her maid cut, fit, and made it for me. In 1896, Amelia Watson illustrated an edition of Henry Thoreau's Cape Cod. Based on items donated by her family to the Lenox Library, it is probable that she wanted to do the same for the Georgia journals of both Fanny and Fan. The comparisons between photograph and watercolor is pretty stark. For instance, in this image, the road to St. Simon's, and a butler slave cabin made out of tabby. And a romanticized rendering of the plantation home. Habersham Munjin, a former butler slave, did not make it into the painting. In fact, the only human figures we see in any of Watson's paintings are distant black stick figures. Butler Place no longer stands. The plantation was inherited by Sarah's son, novelist Owen Wister, author of The Virginian. He sold it to Colonel Tillinghast Lumsden Houston, owner of the New York Yankees of all things, in 1926. The perch is also gone. By the time Amelia Watson made a pilgrimage to Lenox in 1915, Cortlandt Field Bishop had it torn down to build a garage for his collection of autocars. This brings us to the 1868 reading and Fanny's response to Julius Rockwell. Dear Judge Rockwell, what a good inspiration it was that made you write that kind and cheering note to me, which I have just read with the tears in my eyes. A passage from one of her memoirs reads, being asked by my friends there to give a public reading, it became a question to what purpose the proceeds of the entertainment could best be applied. I suggested the poor of the village, but we have no poor, was the reply. And the sum produced by the reading was added to a fund which established an excellent public library. For though Lenox had no paupers, it had numerous intelligent readers among its population. She read in the courtroom, our current dome room, at a table bedecked with flowers from the gardens of the Hive. The play was As You Like It.